From poor infrastructure, skills shortage to lack of financing, African agriculture faces various challenges that affect the sector's growth, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated them. William Asiko, the Managing Director for the Africa Regional Office at the Rockefeller Foundation, discusses some of the innovative solutions for that.
Obviously, agriculture is really important on the African continent. As you know, more than 75% of the population rely in some shape or form on agriculture, not just for food, but for their incomes and livelihoods. And so it's a critical part of our being and our economic activity. But yes, as you're saying, it faces very many challenges. And over the years, the challenges have evolved. When we first started the challenges, I think, in the earlier years after many African countries got their independence, the challenges were really around productivity and increasing productivity of agriculture on the continent. And so a lot of investment was put into productivity, increasing yields, better seed, subsidized fertilizer, better farming practices. And that did a lot in increasing the yields on the continent. And some countries were better than others, but many countries saw yields improve significantly. However, yields remain low. If you compare what we get per hectare from what we get in Africa and other countries around the world, our yields are still low. So there's a lot of work to be done. The other thing around agriculture has been, it's not just about yields. It's not just about productivity. It's about markets. It's about systems. It's about getting the food from farm to fork. And so some of these other things have also got to get into the priorities of African governments and development practitioners like ourselves. From a Rockefeller perspective, what we have done is, together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, nearly 10 years ago, set up the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. And AGRA's role is really to address these challenges. And they started very strongly around the idea of increasing yields, the right policies with governments and right seeds, working on fertilizers. And they have been very successful in the countries in which they operate. So that was sort of one approach that the Rockefeller Foundation took. But we also launched a program called YieldWise, because like I said, in agriculture, it's not just about productivity. There is about 30% of everything we produce on the continent in agriculture is lost because of poor post-harvest management. 30%. So you increase yields, and then farmers don't have markets. You increase yields of perishable products, and then they cannot be sold fast enough, and there's no way to store them effectively. And so our YieldWise program worked with policymakers, with the private sector, and with farmers to create post-harvest management strategies to try to reduce post-harvest losses by 50% according to the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030.
Yes.
Now, so that's in a summary what we have
You've
done.
just touched on some of the things that Rockefeller is actually doing in response to the challenges here on the continent. And we know that innovation is at the core of the works that is done by the foundation. Now, just tell us, when you look at the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges and the impacts that it actually had on agriculture sector here on the continent, what are some of the innovative solutions that have come forward just during this period?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. And obviously, COVID has had many impacts on different sectors. But for agriculture, the way it has manifested is obviously the first impact we saw with the social distancing requirements was the closing down of our food markets. And in Africa, our informal food markets, we call them wet markets, they are the Walmarts, they are the Tesco's of Africa. And this is where farmers sell their produce. This is where consumers buy their food. You close down a wet market in any part of Africa, and you are impacting the entire food system in that area. So one of the biggest challenges for agriculture, immediately the pandemic hit and the lockdown procedures were put in place, was the closing down of these wet markets because of the nature of these markets. They're obviously areas which can easily transmit the virus from person to person. So one of the first things we did was to work with governments, and we started a pilot in Kenya to develop guidelines for how wet markets can be socially distant compliant, how they can be a little more hygienic by, providing washing facilities, providing hand sanitizers, distancing the stalls between different sellers to ensure that the markets would at least in some shape or form remain open. These guidelines were developed along with our partner AGRA, with the Ministry of Agriculture, and rolled out to the counties, which are now implementing. And we see this as a pilot for that. We will pilot here in Kenya, but could really work elsewhere in Africa. Is how to keep these wet markets socially distant compliant. The second thing we're doing, which is of a more longer term nature, that was more immediate, that was a response to a real situation that was happening. The second opportunity we're thinking of in a more long term basis is how can this pandemic offer us an opportunity to rethink our markets? Obviously our wet markets in Africa are, quite, they're vibrant, they're informal, they work, but they're also inefficient. They're also, in many respects, not the most hygienic places that you want to be in. And so how can we rethink the whole wet market system in Africa and create a smart market for Africa? One that is easy to construct with local materials, one that uses renewable energy like solar to provide power, one that has water access, it has cleaning facilities, it has washrooms that are usable, and design this market in a way that even local governments, as local as you can get anywhere in Africa, could construct a market across Africa. This is the vision we have as Rockefeller for smart markets for Africa.
Yes. Now, William, you've touched on AGRA a couple of times. I just want to understand, what are some of the policies that have actually been implemented from the conversations that have been happening across the continent?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that AGRA has been very successful in is improving seed quality. Now, if you think about this question of improving seed quality, it's not just a question of providing farmers with new seeds. There are lots of regulations around seeds. All countries have regulations. They want certain seeds to be treated in a certain way, especially if they're imported. Local research facilities have to certify them, and so on. One of the things that AGRA has been very successful in doing is harmonizing seed policies and working with governments to create seed policies and practices that are accessible to the private sector, so that the private sector, which has got resources for research and that can provide seeds that are disease resistant, that provide high quality yields, and then provide these to farmers. So, that's the one thing. The area around seeds, I think, is one thing that even AGRA would admit, they have done quite well in the countries in which they operate in. Secondly, is the area of input. So fertilizers, for example, that's another area that governments have really struggled with. How do you provide smallholder farmers with a sustainable supply of fertilizer? Now, in many cases, they've used subsidies, in others, they simply just distribute. And of course, because of the inefficiency of procurement systems in many governments, you find that the supply is erratic. Subsidies sometimes lead to wasted resources. Again, through AGRA's work, through working with policymakers, working with governments, they have streamlined in many countries in which they work in this idea of providing inputs at affordable and effective prices in a sustainable manner to smallholder farmers. I think those are the two major areas from a policy perspective. There are others, but we can talk about them later.
Yeah, there are others. Now, just when you look at the issue of funding here on the continent, would you say that budget allocation, especially to the agriculture sector, is enough, or is funding still one of the main challenges here on the continent?
Yes, that is an excellent question, Fiona. Obviously, that is at the very heart of the challenges that many African countries face with their agriculture. Is the question of investment. And I think you may be well aware that the African heads of state in Malabo 5 years ago set a target of 10% budget allocation for the agricultural sector. Many countries have even come close to achieving this. And the reason the heads of state made this commitment was that they recognized that without investment in extension services to provide farmers with good farming practices, without investment in creating markets that are effective, without investment in infrastructure that assists farmers to get their produce to market, but also to get their inputs from distributors and retailers to their farms, that you are not going to be able to move the needle on increasing agricultural productivity. And so this 10% target was set by the heads of state 5 years ago. We are 5 years into the commitment, and it is still lagging behind. So that is a key challenge that African governments have to face. The second issue around investment is the idea of the private sector. Also in Malabo, the governments realized that the governments, the governments themselves were not going to be able to make the required investments at the levels that were necessary in order to move the needle on agricultural productivity. The private sector needs to be encouraged to come in either as anchor buyers, as input suppliers, or extension. Those kind of things which governments have traditionally done but have a commercial viability. They have potential to have a profitable return. Those should be handed over to the private sector. And the heads of state in Malabo acknowledged this, and they said, we also want to increase private sector investment into agricultural value chains. Now, what does that mean? That means you have to put in place the policies, the enabling environment. The private sector just doesn't come in. The private sector, is exactly that. They have an interest in doing activities that return a profit for the investors. And so you have to create an environment where the private sector feels that they can make the investment, get a reasonable return, their investments are secure, but they can also work with farmers who are keen to work with them, who are keen to increase their productivity, work with farmers who are ready to aggregate in a way that makes it easy for the private sector to buy from them, and so on. So those are the two big areas around
Yes.
investment that still remain a challenge
Yes.
on the continent.
Now, William, before I let you go, we're saying the continent also aims to reduce malnutrition by at least 50% by 2023 under the Agenda 2063, among other targets. When you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, how has it jeopardized this target being achieved?
Yes, malnutrition has multiple causes, but of course, the biggest challenge with malnutrition has, of course, been food security and the issue of the fact that many countries in Africa still rely on rain-fed agriculture. So, when the rain leads to poor productivity, low yields, and therefore food security goes up. And many countries have not put in place mechanisms to counter this food insecurity issue. That's one big cause of malnutrition. But what we are also seeing increasingly in Africa is not just malnutrition from hunger. We are also beginning to see serious diseases that Africans are suffering because of poor diet. So they may well have, enough to eat, but the food is highly processed, sometimes high calorie intake, and we're seeing an increase in non-communicable diseases, lifestyle diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure. And so these things are beginning to put pressure on medical infrastructure in Africa. And, they are two sides of the same coin. And so if we are trying to, the solution, of course, to malnutrition is to ensure that food security policies are sound, that governments put in place secure food security issues are tabled and investment is put behind them. But also we need to increase the amount of land we put under irrigation. Very, very low amount of land is agriculture is produced under irrigation in Africa today. Potential is huge. So that's one area we can look at. The second is we really need to look at the food that is being produced in Africa for us to eat, the way it is being managed, the way it is being processed, and the way it is being sold.